Last Friday, 3 judges in New Orleans signed an order that, for about 72 hours, changed the rules for how a pregnancy can be ended in the United States. Monday morning, one Supreme Court justice signs a different order that changed them back, at least until next week. By the time you hear this, lawyers for 2 drug companies and 1 state will have filed briefs that were due Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern. By next Monday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, those 9 judges will have decided whether the pill the country has been arguing about for 25 years can keep arriving in mailboxes, or whether for the first time in 3 years, a woman has to walk into a clinic to get it. That's the legal story. It will be on the front page of every paper in America by the weekend. You don't need me for the legal story. Here's what you need me for. When that envelope arrives, what's inside it is a steroid receptor antagonist called Mifepristone. It blocks the hormone progesterone, which is what holds a pregnancy in place. 36 to 48 hours later, the woman is supposed to take a second drug, Mifepristone, that causes her uterus to contract and expel what's now a non-viable pregnancy. The FDA has approved this regimen up to 10 weeks of gestation. Most women are at home when the second drug works. Most are also alone. I'm a nurse and I've stood next to women who have made decisions. I'm not going to tell you their stories. That's not mine to do. But I am going to tell you clinically what those nights look like, because somehow that part of this story has gone almost entirely unspoken in the coverage I've read this week. This is the first part of a 2-part series. Today, the legal story and the clinical reality. And next week, the question pundits aren't asking about informed consent and what the Catholic Church sees that the court is not equipped to see. So I'm Christine. You're listening to TradNurse. Let's get into it. Just a disclaimer before we begin, nothing in this episode is medical, legal, or pastoral advice. If you are in need of a medical emergency, call 911. If you are pregnant and frightened, you are not alone. There are people who will sit with you through this. All right. Let's start with what happened in the courts this week, because if you've been getting this story from the headlines, it's been moving fast. And the headlines have been a little jumpy. Mifepristone was approved by the FDA in the year 2000 with an in-person dispensing requirement under what's called a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, REMS for short. That's a specific designation the FDA gives to drugs that need controls beyond a normal prescription. In 2021, during COVID, the FDA temporarily relaxed the in-person rule. In 2023, it made the change permanent. Mifepristone could now be prescribed by telehealth, mailed to the patient's home, and dispensed by retail pharmacies. The in-person requirement was gone. That brings us to last October, when the state of Louisiana sued the FDA. Louisiana's argument in plain terms was this 2023 change undermines our state's nearly complete ban on abortion, and it forces our Medicaid system to spend money treating women who show up in our emergency departments after taking the drug at home. Both of those, Louisiana said, were real and ongoing harms. Last Friday, May 1st, a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, in an opinion written by Judge Stuart Kyle Duncan, granted Louisiana's request. They reinstated the in-person dispensing requirements nationwide, not just in Louisiana, nationwide. And they did it immediately. No grace period, no phase-in, effective Friday. Judge Duncan's reasoning, and this is paraphrased, telehealth access to Mifepristone causes Louisiana 2 kinds of injury. The first is that it undermines Louisiana's laws protecting unborn human life. The second is that it forces Louisiana to spend Medicaid funds on emergency care for women harmed by the drug. Both injuries, he said, were irreparable. So the in-person requirement came back immediately everywhere. The two drug companies that make Mifepristone, Danco Laboratories, which makes the brand name version, and GenBioPro, which makes the generic version, they both filed emergency appeals to the Supreme Court that weekend. Their argument was that women across the country had appointments scheduled to receive the drug by mail. Pharmacies had it queued up to ship, and the Fifth Circuit's order had created immediate confusion. Justice Samuel Alito handles emergency requests from the Fifth Circuit. He responded Monday morning, May 4th, with what's called an administrative stay. That's a procedural pause. It doesn't decide anything. It just freezes the situation while the court figures out what to do. The administrative stay restored mail and telehealth access to Mifepristone for now. It expires Monday, May 11th at 5 p.m., and that's 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Briefs from the FDA and from Louisiana were due Thursday, May 7th at 5 p.m. Eastern. So that's the calendar. The full court is going to look at this between today and Monday. By next week, we'll have a clearer picture of how access to this drug is going to look for the foreseeable future. If you want to look up the case names, write these down. Danco Laboratories versus Louisiana, and then GenBioPro versus Louisiana. I'll put the docket number down below. Now, I want to take you somewhere the legal coverage doesn't go, is general clinical information. I'm not going to identify any patient. I am not going to share any specific clinical case. Anything that sounds like a patient's story is a composite. If you're a clinician listening, you'll recognize the patterns. If you are not, what I want you to come away with is an accurate sense of what this drug does and what taking it actually involves. So the pharmacology in plain language, Mifepristone is a synthetic steroid. Pharmacologically, it's what we call a competitive antagonist of the progesterone receptor. Progesterone, the name comes from progestation, is the hormone that maintains a pregnancy. It tells the uterine lining to stay thick and stable. It tells the uterus not to contract. Mifepristone goes to those same receptors, attaches to them, and blocks progesterone from binding. The lining starts to break down. The pregnancy can no longer be sustained. Misoprostol, the second drug, is a prostaglandin. Prostaglandins are signaling molecules involved in inflammation, blood flow, and relevant here, uterine contraction. Misoprostol causes the cervix to soften and the uterus to contract forcefully. The contractions expel the pregnancy. The standard regimen is Mifepristone first, taken orally, 200 milligrams, I think. And then 24 to 48 hours later, misoprostol, typically 800 micrograms. Don't quote me on the actual dosages. Dissolved between the cheek and gum. The FDA has approved this regimen for use up to 70 days or 10 weeks of gestation, measured from the first day of the last menstrual period. So now to the safety numbers, because this is where the public conversation tends to get murky. The FDA labeling for Mifepristone reports serious adverse reactions in fewer than 0.5% of women in the clinical studies that the agency reviewed, less than half of 1%. That's the number you see in every defense of the drug, and it's not made up. It comes from real clinical trial data. But, and this is where being a nurse helps, that 0.5% number is reporting serious adverse reactions, hospitalization, transfusion, surgery, death. It is not reporting all complications. A peer-reviewed article in the journal American Family Physician, that's the journal of the American Academy of Family Physicians, which is not a pro-life advocacy group, reported the overall complication rate of medication abortion after appropriate in-person evaluation at 5.2%. 5.2, that's an order of magnitude higher than what you usually see quoted. And it includes things the FDA's serious category leaves out. Retained products of conception, hemorrhage that doesn't require a transfusion, infections that need antibiotics but not hospitalization, and incomplete abortions that require a follow-up surgical procedure, and any mental health issues that follow afterwards. So you have two real numbers, less than 0.5% serious adverse reactions, 5.2% overall complications. Both are accurate. Which one a journalist quotes tells you almost everything about how that journalist wants you to feel about this drug. There's a second fact that almost never makes it into the coverage. In 2016, the FDA modified the Mifepristone REMS, risk evaluation mitigation strategy, to no longer require manufacturers to report non-fatal adverse events. Only deaths must be reported. Everything below the fatal threshold, the hemorrhages, the infections, the incomplete abortions, is now reported on a voluntary basis. The publicly available adverse event database, which is called FAERS, FAERS, like VAERS, but FAERS. It stands for the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, and that's the database for prescription drugs other than vaccines. Almost certainly undercounts complications from this drug. You don't have to be pro-life to find that troubling. You just have to believe in data. And there's a third fact, and this one is purely mathematical. The risk of complication from medication abortion increases with gestational age. So past 49 days to 7 weeks, the rates of retained products of conception and significant hemorrhage start climbing. And the FDA approved regimen goes to 70 days. So there's a real curve mathematically in the back end of that approved window. And here's what it actually looks like hour by hour. I want to spend some time on this because this is the part of the conversation that has gone almost entirely unspoken in the mainstream coverage. The question I keep getting asked is, what is it actually like for a woman who takes these 2 pills at home alone? And let me walk you through it clinically. This is not advocacy. This is what we know happens, supported by the FDA's own labeling and by the studies the FDA reviewed when it approved the drug. Day 1, she takes the Mifepristone. Usually in the first 24 hours, she doesn't feel much. Some women have mild nausea, some have a little fatigue, some have nothing at all. The drug is binding the progesterone receptors and blocking the hormone. But the uterus hasn't been told yet to expel anything. Pregnancy symptoms, sore breasts, fatigue, food aversion often start to fade, but the body hasn't started its part yet. Day 2 or sometimes day 3, the woman takes the misoprostol. The instruction is to plan for the next 24 hours to be the hard part. Most clinics tell her to be home and to have someone with her if possible, to have heavy pads, ibuprofen, a heating pad, a thermometer, and a way to call for help. Within 1 to 4 hours of taking the misoprostol, the cramping begins. Most women describe it as significantly worse than a menstrual cramp, closer to the active phase of labor, except compressed into a few hours. The cervix softens, the uterus contracts hard. Bleeding starts, and within a few hours, the bleeding is very heavy. Most women will pass clots, sometimes the size of a quarter, sometimes the size of a lemon, sometimes larger. At earlier gestational ages, the pregnancy tissue itself may be visibly distinguishable from the bleeding. At later gestational ages, closer to that 10-week limit, the pregnancy tissue is more developed, and many women see it clearly. That can be unexpected. The pre-procedure counseling at telehealth visits varies in how thoroughly this is discussed. Some women report being told what to expect. Others report being unprepared. The misoprostol is also a gastrointestinal drug. That's why it's also approved for ulcer prevention and used in obstetrics for postpartum hemorrhage. The systemic effects can include diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, chills, low-grade fever, and shivering. Now you have a woman who is cramping intensely, bleeding heavily, and possibly experiencing GI distress, all at the same time, often alone and in a bathroom. Within 6 to 12 hours, for an uncomplicated course, the heaviest part is over. Bleeding tapers from heavy to moderate. Cramping starts to ease. She passes the pregnancy tissue, sometimes recognizing it and sometimes not, depending on gestational age. She tries to clean up. She tries to sleep. Bleeding continues, and now more like a heavy period. For somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks. She is supposed to follow up either by an in-person visit or a telehealth check-in, somewhere between 1 and 4 weeks out. The follow-up is meant to confirm that the pregnancy was fully expelled and that she's not still bleeding too much. That is the intended clinical course. That is the case where it goes the way it's supposed to go. And what I want you to notice, even in that intended course, is that this is not a routine medication. This is not antibiotics for an ear infection. This is a controlled medical event with significant pain, significant bleeding, the visible passage of tissues, and a real psychological dimension that is in no way captured by the phrase medication abortion. That is true regardless of where any individual listener falls on the underlying moral question of this. So now let me tell you what the complicated course looks like, because as a nurse, this is the part I want you to understand. The textbook threshold for hemorrhage requiring emergency evaluation after a medication abortion is soaking through more than 2 pads per hour for more than 2 consecutive hours. That's the number I want you to remember. Soaking, meaning fully saturated, not spotted on. 2 pads per hour, 2 hours in a row. Past that point, you are to go to the emergency department. And you should. Some women hemorrhage barely enough to need transfusion. Some need an emergency D&C to remove the tissue the medication didn't fully expel. Some develop endometritis, which is an infection of the uterine lining, and they need IV antibiotics. A small number develop sepsis. There have been documented deaths from a particular type of bacterial infection called Clostridium sordelli that can produce a delayed onset toxic-like shock syndrome days or even weeks after the medication. It is rare, but it is documented in the FDA's adverse event summary. And then there is the case I worry about most as a nurse. Mifepristone does not treat ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy that has implanted somewhere outside the uterus, usually in a fallopian tube. It is dangerous if it ruptures, and it can be rapidly fatal. A woman who takes mifepristone for a pregnancy that's actually ectopic will get bleeding, cramping, and pain. From the symptoms alone, a woman at home, and frankly, sometimes a clinician on the phone, cannot reliably distinguish between an expected medication abortion and a rupturing ectopic. The CDC reports that roughly 1 to 2% of pregnancies are ectopic. In a fully telehealth-only model, the patient self-reports her last menstrual period. There is no ultrasound. There is no physical exam. So this is the clinical reality of self-managed at home. It is not a euphemism for easy. It is not a euphemism for routine. It is a euphemism for the medical event happens in her bathroom. And most of what could go wrong, she will have to recognize on her own. And most of the time, she will be alone. I am telling you this because I think people on both sides of this debate often talk about this drug as if it were aspirin. And I think doing that, whether you are for it or against it, is dishonest about what we are actually putting in the mail for these women. So that's the legal story. That's the clinical reality of what's actually in the envelope. By Monday, May 11th at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court will have decided whether that envelope keeps arriving in mailboxes or whether it doesn't. I will be watching that decision closely, and hopefully so will you. But the legal question and the clinical question are only the front half of this conversation. The harder half, the part of the story that's gotten almost no airtime in the coverage this week, is about what this whole arrangement assumes about consent, about what we owe each other, about who counts as a someone. And that's where the Catholic Church has language that the court doesn't have. And that's where I want to take you next week. Part 2 of this conversation, The Question Pundits Don't Ask, drops next week. And if you want to make sure you don't miss it, please subscribe. I'm Christine, and this has been part 1 of TradNurse on the Mifepristone ruling. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.